Welcome, everybody. We gather here today to grieve the death and to celebrate the life of George Kingsbury. We say goodbye reluctantly and with heavy hearts. We have come together to remember him and to let him go, to be together with those who share the grief and sorrow of our loss, to begin the healing that we need each other for. When a person dies, family and friends gather for many reasons. Life has touched them with a deep grief, and they need one another's company for their own comfort. Just to be together, to look in friends' faces and see the common expression of hurt, takes away the loneliness of their feelings and draws their hearts together in the blessed healing that we can do for one another. At such a time, the various faiths which sustain us separately come together in a harmony which acts across all creeds and assures us of the permanence of goodness, the inspiration of dedication, the value of a human life. I light this chalice, symbol of our Unitarian Universalist faith, in honor of the life we celebrate today. George's stepdaughter, Janice, will read from Psalm 23.
This is the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
We shall never fill the place which has now been vacated by George, at least not in the flesh. Against such a void, we can only exert courage and have faith in the knowledge that time does heal and memories do soften the wounds of such a loss. But in the spirit, that place is not emptied. The force that animates this continuing immortality is love. It is because they loved us and we them that our dead remain an immortal presence. Indeed, we must believe that whatever we have known and loved is ours. That whatever we have loved becomes a part of us, interfused with our lives, blended with mind and memory, joined to our souls. The dead are not dead if we have loved them truly. In our own lives, we give them immortality. In this death, it may be said that all of us who lived in George's special affection have died a little. But in his life, we have also found a richer and more abundant life. My hope for each of you is that you will go on strong in the faith that, despite death, life is somehow good, even though we do not understand its mystery or its way. Let's sing together in honor of the earth that George so loved, For the Beauty of the Earth. It's number 21 in your hymn book. Please be seated. We have 4 people today who are giving the eulogy. People who all knew George better than I did, for sure. And I would like to mention that Phil Faulkner unfortunately couldn't be with us today because he has laryngitis and isn't feeling well. So his son, Barry Faulkner, will read his words. I also would like to mention at this point that the meditation music that you'll be hearing later in the service is not the Horace Toccata that we could not find. So Vladimir will play us something equally beautiful.
Can't help but notice that the flowers behind me are in an ash pack basket, something I think George would truly appreciate. Bob Kingsbury asked if I'd say a few words about one aspect of his father's life, his love of the outdoors. That love reached into the heart of George, as any of you knows who walked with him with his land off West Street or sailed with him on Granite Lake. Our time together, though, was spent mainly on trout water, holding fly rods. We usually fished with our friend Steve Smith from Hancock, the 3 of us sharing not only an interest in the Hexagenia mayfly hatch up on Sourdohunk Lake in northern Maine, but an interest as well in wooden boats and reading and history. We fished together all over Cheshire County: Willard, Hunts, Caldwell, Center Pond in Nelson, the Ashwellet River in Marlow. In the fall, when the foliage was peaking, we'd hike up to Lake Solitude on the backside of Mount Sunapee, where for a time we had stashed one of George's old dinghies for our personal use. I met George in the mid-1980s at the Keene Country Club at a meeting of the local Dartmouth alumni group. He had an old world formality about him and an air of class that appealed to me and intimidated me. Yet his eyes sparkled, and his humanity seemed to radiate from him. Many of you know what I mean by that. And we almost instantly struck up a friendship around fly fishing. He was 70 years old then, and I was just 2 years out of college. But the difference in our ages didn't seem to matter at all. On our first long trip together, we slogged down the inlet stream into Allagash Lake, wading through muck and hauling the canoes over beaver dams. The July air was humid and buggy, and in the afternoon, rain began to fall. It was a discouraging way to start a first trip together, but a good way to learn about someone's character. George was having the time of his life. He seemed tickled to be in the company of a couple of young guys, and he seemed to relish the hard work. When we finally made camp, he took some butterscotch candies from his pocket and said, "I suppose you fellows earned these." A little later, he pulled off his wet boots and socks and found some small leeches attached to his ankles. "Well, would you look at that," he said, laughing. "I thought I felt something funny." On our third or fourth night in, George took out his harmonica and in his modest way told us that he'd been part of a pretty fair harmonica band back in high school. He played beautifully for us as a fire burned at our feet and a steady rain fell on the tarp above us. Talk about high school drifted back to talk about college and the 2 summers in the late 1930s that George had hiked in the Tetons in Wyoming. He sounded wistful as he talked about leaving that wild high country behind and returning home to Keene to go into the family business. I know that a part of him stayed out there forever, and that his decision to settle back in New Hampshire was one of the great forks in his life. I understood his decision, and I admired him for it, because I had once faced a similar fork and had selfishly gone the other way. During long days sharing a canoe or wading alongside each other in streams, there was much we didn't talk about. In that sense, George was a true New Englander. He talked at length about Zane Grey's novels and conservation easements, but little about the family tragedies he'd lived through, little about his time in the war, almost never about his own health. For my part, I never told him that he gave me an image of what I hoped to grow into: a vigorous outdoorsman, a gentleman of integrity and kindness who never lost his boyish sense of enthusiasm, someone at home in the country and at the country club both. We had Keene and Dartmouth in common. He had been a student at Dartmouth in a golden age when Hanover was still bordered on wilderness and the college was building its national reputation as an outdoor school of the first degree. I pictured him as a leader of the Dartmouth Outing Club, a champion skier, an acolyte to Ross McKenney, Dartmouth's legendary woodcraft advisor who had been a Maine guide and river driver. That picture somehow made me feel connected in the lineage. In fact, George hadn't done much outdoors when he was at Dartmouth. He was an English major who ran on the track team. But I sensed that later he wished that a bit of that picture had been true. As Midge's eyesight and health declined, and George no longer dared leave her alone overnight, Steve and I planned shorter fishing outings with side trips so George could see Dartmouth's 26,000-acre wilderness in northern New Hampshire for the first time, see Dartmouth's Ravine Lodge on Mount Moosilauke, the Dartmouth Skiway. George seemed especially excited about the side trips. I think they meant something deep to him. He was starting to slow down himself by then. He no longer felt safe driving at night, and our friendship turned tender. He begged off on a trip because of a cold, and Steve and I bagged the fishing and brought store-bought salmon to his house for dinner to cheer him up. By the end of our time fishing together, George had grown too stiff to sit in a canoe for very long. He offered me his arm for support, walking over rough ground. I tied on his wispy 6X tippet material and his tiny number 18 dry flies for him. My eyesight was good. He accepted the help absolutely, without complaint or apology. He accepted his aging as naturally as he'd accepted the friendship of someone nearly 5 decades younger than he was. He gave me the rare gift of grace, and I see clearly now it was never about the fishing. Thank you.
I am humbled to be standing before you today. Thank you, Bob, for asking us to gather and share some special memories from the many people who knew and loved George. You all know the Kingsbury roots run deep in the Monadnock region, deep into the soft, fertile ground wherever we land. In our case, our connection to the land goes way back to Abijah Kingsbury. I think of my cousin, Ed Kingsbury, who was Young Dairy Farmer of the Year in Vermont, of my father, who raised champion 4-H chickens and cows on the West Surrey Road, and of my grandfather, who proudly planted those pine trees down Maple Ave and up the old Walpole Road. George and I had many a warm chuckle as we shared stories of family members, story about those of us who love to feel the soil between our fingers, the smell of hay in a newly mown field, and feel the softness of wool as it is drawn through fingers and spun into yarn. Today, my husband Phil is not with us because he is doing something George would appreciate. He is loading up hundreds of families in an old-fashioned wagon and bringing them to pick out their Christmas trees. They all will feel closer to nature as our big Belgian draft horses pull them across the field along the Connecticut River. Each child and parent will take out a bow saw and cut down it onto the side of the carriage as they make their way back to the barn. The tangy aroma of freshly cut balsam will permeate the crisp air. As most of you know, George went green before it was fashionable. The Dartmouth connection too, big green, right? When he returned from serving our country during World War II, he purchased his farm from the Faulkner family. As Phil Faulkner told me, it was during the Depression, and this white elephant would eventually become George's golden opportunity. For 30 years, he lived on and loved the farm, but continued to work each day in the well-known family business. Their farmhouse was a favorite hub of activity for all of the neighborhood kids, especially when it came to Halloween. I've heard lots of good stories about Halloween. As one neighbor shared, George was the perfect neighbor. And his home is where all of the kids could always go to get a sale, whether there was Girl Scout cookies or wrapping paper or whatever it was. When he sold Tilden's in 1976 at the young age of 60, it was time to live out his dream to be a farmer. George sought the advice of a local extension agent, and in his gentlemanly way, he found his niche as a shepherd, a sheep farmer. Think of George's traits, and think of the traits of a shepherd. Patient, kind, loves to be outdoors on the land, appreciates the seasonal cycles of breeding, lambing, culling, shearing, and marketing. And true to form, George was not just a shepherd. He became the first New Hampshire master shepherd. I have special memories of that day in 2003 when George decided it was time to sell the farm. And he invited Phil and I over for a visit. We drove or walked to every corner of his property as he proudly told us about the lifetime of work he devoted to steward this special piece of land. We gazed up at Mount Monadnock and talked about what a wonderful place it would be for a winter sleigh ride. We watched the flock of turkeys pecking along the edge of the field We saw a mother and her fawn sniff the air. And yes, we did get our feet wet in that wetland at the back of his property. We lamented the loss of his old beautiful barn, which had burned along with many of his treasures. But also, we celebrated the fact that he had the foresight to put his 100 acres in a conservation easement so that it would never be developed and could be enjoyed in perpetuity. George was so pleased that the current owners are using the land, keeping it open, and sharing it with so many other both two-legged and four-legged friends. Kathy Snow said it well. George took the road less traveled. He wanted to have his land cared for and to know that his land will stand forever free of development, just the way God meant it to be, just like George, always himself, always good, just the way God meant him to be. The last few months have been especially hard for us as we lost our 220-year-old barn to a fire. George was one of the first people to call. He knew firsthand how precious those antique sleighs and cultivators and wagons and other horse-drawn equipment were. And he helped us do what he always did. Even through unbelievable personal tragedy, he helped us look forward and not back. So the day of the fire, the day he called, is the day we started planning to build our next barn. Late this past fall, it was George who drove up to Fred Babbitt's and asked him for help moving an old sailboat. He was hoping to be back on the lake again next spring after renovating the Comet. Always looking forward. Every week when I visited George, I shared pictures showing him the progress of our barn raising project. And I remember one day sitting by his window when he was on the second floor at Langdon Place and watching the blue heron that he loved to watch there rising out of the little pond. So he was always looking, always paying attention to what was going on outside. When I went to be with him late one evening, just recently in the emergency room, his first question to me, as he's laying there in his bed, is, "Are the horses in the barn yet?" Today, our hearts are full of warmth and affection for George and what he stood for in his quiet, inspirational way. Just like Kate Hanna and others have said, when I talked to George, he made me feel like I was the only one in the room. He looked at me with those beautiful, twinkling sky blue eyes under those big bushy eyebrows, kind of like the fleece. And he made me feel like there was nothing better that could be happening in his life at that moment. What a special gift George was to all of us, to the land he loved, and to those who are inspired to follow in his footsteps. Today, as you leave, I would like to share something with each of you. A handful of fleece. Maybe you can put it in your manger scenes at home or in your pocket. But this warm wool came from a local New Hampshire sheep farmer who benefited from George's advice and practical lessons when he was starting out. He learned lessons about sheep and lessons about life, just like all of us learned from George.
My father wrote these words about George's connection to the community. You know George a lot longer than I did, and I'm just going to read what my father wrote. So if you'd be so kind as to translate, when I say my or me or I, translate back one generation. My earliest memory of George goes back to the 1930s, when George graduated from Dartmouth and I was in high school. I had a great respect for George and looked at my older cousin as a role model. As I got to know George over the following 70 years, this respect only increased. George had a love for family and community history. I remember talking with George and his brother Putt about our Kingsbury ancestors. Nathaniel and his brother Daniel were the first Kingsburys to move to Keene prior to the Revolutionary War. It was Nathaniel's son, Abijah, who appeared to be George's favorite ancestor. Abijah was born in Keene in 1778. He was George's great-great-grandfather. He had 11 children, all of whom lived beyond the age of 65. Quite unusual in those days, but perhaps that explains why there are so many Kingsbury cousins today. Abijah, like George and George's father, was a Main Street merchant. He and two of his sons made and sold shoes and boots. After a fire, Abijah erected a new building in 1814 that included both his store and his residence. The building was next door to the location at the corner of Main and Gilboa, where Tilden's was located a century and a half later. George enjoyed sharing his stories about Keene history. In the 1990s, when Ashwilla River Park was expanded, middle school students had a school project to explore and learn about the history of the Ashwilla River. George, his sister Betty, and I were invited to share with the students our memories of the river when we were youngsters. As one teacher put it, George mesmerized the students with his stories about his favorite swimming spot on the river, complete with a long rope attached to a large tree branch, and how the youngsters used to swing out to the middle of the river and drop in. He told of ice skating on the river and the hockey rink and the old mill pond, which has now been filled in. George pointed out there was no adult supervision. The older boys watched out for the younger boys, made sure they didn't get into trouble. And in September of this year, George shared his personal experiences during the hurricane of 1938 on a video shown to a full house at the Colonial, and I know many of you probably saw that video. George felt that the community had been good to him, and he wanted to pay it back by serving in a leadership role in organizations within the community. Here are some of the organizations he served: Cheshire Medical Center, the YMCA, Boy Scouts, Keene Rotary Club for 62 years, Keene Public Library, the Keene School District. In 2006, George completed 5 active years on the Keene Heritage Commission at the age of 90, a record age, I believe, for any city board or commission member. He was a longtime member of the Romeos, that's the retired old men eating out, a small group that meets twice a month for lunch to discuss community activities and issues. He served as chairman of the board of directors of the Indian Head Bank. Dick Duggar tells of George's leadership role in the merger of the Ashwilla National Bank with Indian Head. The two banks had been competitors for many years, but George set the positive tone for the joint meetings of the two boards of directors, and as Dick said, the merger was completed successfully with grace and dignity. This is a great example of George's ability to get people to work together to get the job done well. During the past 2 weeks, I've spoken to a number of people about George, and here are some of the words and phrases that people used when talking about him. He was a true gentleman from the old school. He was genuine, a good listener, great sense of humor, inspirational. He set good examples for others to follow. He was warm and engaging. He liked people, and he had many, many friends. He was very positive, even when facing personal and family tragedy. The community is grateful to George for his part in making Keene a better place to live and work. He enriched the lives of those who knew him. As several of his friends have said, George was one of a kind.
One of the understandable tendencies at a time like this is to lionize the person who has died, to speak of him with such abundant excess, and to extol his virtues with such enthusiasm that the real person seems almost saintly. This is obviously a particular danger for us today, not because George lacked virtue, Lord knows, but because George himself would surely roll his eyes. It's impossible not to think of him even now sitting back there in his regular pew, a little embarrassed by all this praise and attention. But one of the last things that George said to me was that I deserved a spanking. which he threatened using a stack of orders of service, a large stack, I must tell you. So I'm going to indulge in this praise anyway because he has earned it and because I've already received my punishment from George in advance. The truth is, I have never encountered in my life a man more deserving of abundant praise than George Kingsbury. He was, quite simply, a great man of uncommon moral character and clarity, a person of such profound kindness that his spirit is still undeniably present in this room, in our grieving hearts, a spirit which lives and breathes even now in each of us. Every person in this sanctuary probably has their own story to tell about George, and I hope you are telling them to one another. For over the course of his long life, he touched virtually everyone in Keene, whether they knew it or not. At one time or another, as we've just heard, he was a vital part of almost every major civic institution in town, from the Cheshire Medical Center and the Keene Public Library to the Chamber of Commerce and the YMCA. He served on boards and government committees. He ran capital campaigns and oversaw building projects, including the construction of the religious education wing here at the Keene Unitarian Universalist Church. This list is so long that it would be easy to gloss over the amount of time and energy he devoted to each one and to the number of people he touched. It's clear that George truly loved this town and its people. But as far-reaching as George's civic service was, I think it was his character that made him great. Samuel Johnson wrote that the true measure of a man is how he treats someone who can do him absolutely no good. By this account, honor and generosity were George's true measure. He lived a life of service to this community, to his family and to his beloved wife Midge, and to his church. He was deeply connected to other people. And I think he would have rejected Johnson's definition, because George seemed to know that we are all connected to each other, and that we are therefore constantly able to do good for one another. This was not just George's civic modus operandi. It was his worldview. It was his theology, and he lived it well. I think there is no higher praise than that for a man. George once said that he liked the definition of church as a place where people come to practice being the best people they can be. And this congregation is where George practiced, not that he seemed to need any, mind you. And so many of us here practiced with him. George grew up in the Keene Unitarian Universalist Church before it was called that, and he came here faithfully, Sunday after Sunday, year after year. And amidst all the many changes he saw over the last 90 years, all the new words to the old hymns, which you may have noticed as we sang For the Beauty of the Earth, the constant flow of people coming and going, long after the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists, long after the rainbow flag began flying out front, through minister after minister, through it all, George stayed. He wasn't afraid of change, and his courage gave the rest of us courage that we could stay together as a community and as a people of faith. He was a bridge for us, spanning the generations. Ours is a living tradition, and it lived in George. He was the head usher here for more years than anyone can remember. And almost every Sunday, he would greet folks and hopefully not threaten to spank them with stacks of orders of service. He would greet them at the door here or in the back and hand them an order of service and collect the offering. And the tradition here is that once the offering is collected, the ushers process up the center aisle and put the full offering plates on the table up here. But George couldn't just walk up here and put the plate down and walk away. He almost always said something hysterical to the minister. I can attest, yes. And the minister is usually trying to appear all serious and grateful and, have some dignity. Now, I hope that Reverend Jane and Olivia had more success than I did at maintaining my composure, because George always had me cracking. I mean, I was literally rolling in the chair cracking up on Sunday mornings. It was most undignified, which frankly I think he was trying to do. Not that it took much, and he knew it. So one day, after the leadership of this congregation had just honored him during a service, which embarrassed him, I think, George brought the offering plate up here and said in a stage whisper to me, "You know, if you keep talking about me, the offering is really going to suffer." Well, the truth is, I talked about George often from this pulpit to inspire generosity in others, and I must tell you that it worked. It really worked, and it worked because of George. He accepted his elder statesman status with a distinctly mischievous twinkle. He relished it, even as he was quick to laugh at himself. It wasn't just modesty that made him joke with me up here or with so many of you. It was joy, the joy of spreading joy, which he shared throughout his life like a glorious benediction. And perhaps it was just this joy, even more than his devotion to his family and community, that made so many of us want to be like George. He was that rare person whose goodness shined through so clearly that he made people around him want to be better. And it's no wonder to me, given that we mourn him so, for we have lost someone who reminds us what it means to be a good person. And in the midst of our loss, we might take comfort in reflecting on what it is in us that George thought was so dear. After all, we all here were the people George chose to practice with. We're the people that helped this beautiful man become patient and kind, solid and circumspect. So if we lose our way, perhaps when we lose our way, as individuals, as a congregation, as a community, let us try to remember why George chose us. George Kingsbury was a keeper of this town's history and this congregation's history, not because he wanted to be, but because we wanted him to be. We trusted him to tell our story, to hold it, and he did. And now we must be the holders of George's story, and we must tell it. To George's family, his son and daughter-in-law, his sister, his stepchildren, his grandchildren, and cousins, please know that in the quiet moments of your grief today and in the future, we will remember your father, your brother, your grandfather, your cousin. We will remember our dear friend. Some cultures decree that the names of the dead shall never be spoken again. But today we can give thanks that this is not our tradition. Let us all speak of George Kingsbury. Let our children know him by his deeds, if not his words, as they walk into the library or into the high school or into the Y. May no offering in this house be taken without remembering him. His lanky steps, his big, gentle hands, his clever quips, his deep kindness, his sparkling eyes, and his honorable heart. A litany of virtues well earned by this lion of a man. Blessed be George. Blessed be.
Now I invite you to join me at this time in a litany of memory. After I read a line and pause, I invite you to say, "We will remember him." In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we will remember him. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we will remember him. In the opening of buds and the warmth of summer, we will remember him. In the rustling of the leaves and in the beauty of the autumn, we will remember him. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we will remember him. When we are lost and sick of heart, we'll remember him. When we have joys we yearn to share, we'll remember him. So long as we live, he too shall live, for he is now a part of us because we will remember him. Choir will sing for us. currently. Now let us pause for a moment to gather our individual feelings and thoughts, to meditate upon the meaning of this occasion, to remember the man George was and the many and varied ways his life touched ours. Let us reflect together in silence. We are all blessed by the many, many gifts George gave to this congregation, to his family, to the Keene community, to the entire world. Thank you, George. We didn't ask to be born. We do not ask to die. Whatever comes before or after, this interval between is what we have. It is our time. May we here and now resolve to live a little more closely to our values, to care a little more deeply for others, to risk a little more often. And on this day, may we tell someone very clearly that they are valued and they are loved. This is what we can do to honor George. This is what we can do for the love of a friend. And our choir has one more offering. We give thanks for the life of George Kingsbury. And we give thanks for the ways he made this community a better place to live, and for his friendship, concern, and love that filled our lives. May we who mourn George's death be granted the gifts of understanding and acceptance. And may we truly find our sense of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for a good, virtuous life lived fully and fruitfully. We give thanks that George was and is part of our common life. The truth of his life endures, for it is woven into the fabric of the larger life of which we and George are all a part. As we say our final farewell, let us be confident and trusting that a human life is full of meaning and purpose, even in death. May understanding go with us and peace too, that we may live together in charity, compassion, peace, and joy. In this spirit, let us, individually and together, go forth to live and to love. Blessed be. Amen.